Welcome once again to English Bible Talks. And the aim of these easy English Bible Talks is to help you discover more about the Bible so that you can better understand its truths and apply its message to your life. Well, we begin a new series on the Beatitudes, which is an introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. The greatest sermon ever preached is the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 to 7. In this sermon, Jesus redefines what it really means to live a life in a right relationship with God. He begins his sermon with 8 blessing statements known as the Beatitudes, which are listed in Matthew chapter 5 verses 1 to 10. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, the Greek word for blessing that is used in the original text means deep inner happiness, a deep and genuine sense of blessedness, a sense of well-being that the world cannot offer. It is not produced by the world. It is not produced by circumstances, and it is not subject to change by the world or by circumstances. It is given by God. The promise of Christ in the Sermon on the Mount at the very beginning is that if you live by these standards, you will know blessedness. Now, over the next 2 months, I will be talking on these 8 blessing statements. In this talk, we will look at the first blessing statement in Matthew chapter 5, verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It should not surprise us that this is the first of the Beatitudes, because it is the key to all the ones that follow, and the key to understanding the entire Sermon on the Mount. You see, Jesus put the Beatitudes in a logical and definite sequence. Being poor in spirit is the fundamental characteristic of the Christian. And all the other characteristics proceed from this one. But what does it really mean to be poor in spirit? What does it mean? Well, the word that is used here in the original Greek text for poor means absolute poverty. Not poverty with regard to money or possessions. But to be poor in spirit really means to realize that we are spiritually bankrupt, that we cannot serve ourselves. One of the best biblical illustrations of being poor in spirit is the story that Jesus told about the Pharisee and the publican that we read in Luke chapter 18, verses 10 to 14. In this parable of Jesus, he tells us about a certain Pharisee who went to the temple to pray. That is very commendable that he wanted to pray. But this man promoted himself in prayer rather than humbling himself in prayer. He prayed, "I thank God I am not like other men. I fast twice a week, and I give a tenth of all I get." The Pharisee showed his arrogance and pride in all he had done. He thought that he was right with God because of how righteous and holy he was. That was being self-righteous. That was not being poor in spirit. The other man who was a publican that Jesus talked about in the parable was quite different. He stood back in humility. He would not even look up toward heaven. And he beat his breast as an expression of deep, deep sorrow over his sinfulness. His prayer was not elegant nor long. All that he could say to God was, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." And then Jesus said, "I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." The publican went home justified, not because he had done more right things, but because he had the right heart. He was poor in spirit. So how can you know if you are poor in spirit? Well, first, the poor in spirit have a broken and repentant heart. The people who are poor in spirit know that they are sinners who are spiritually bankrupt. They know that they are not righteous and cannot be righteous without God's grace and power. They know that they are saved, but not by works, but by God's grace through what Jesus has done for them on the cross. And second, the poor in spirit are humble. To be poor in spirit means to have an absence of spiritual pride. Pride says, look at me and how good I am. But humility says that any goodness in me comes from God. Pride causes us to compare ourselves with others and says, look at how much better I am than you are. Third, the poor in spirit are dependent on God. One of the most important lessons for us to learn is to stop relying on ourselves and to depend more on God. The poor in spirit learn to walk with God, expressing continual dependence. So how can you become poor in spirit? Well, the answer is not to look at yourself or try to do it yourself. The way we become poor in spirit is to draw near to God through prayer and reading the Bible. Look to God. Seek His presence. Look to God's Son Jesus and learn from Him. He is the best example of one who was poor in spirit. Being poor in spirit has to do with emptying ourselves of all spiritual pride and expressing our dependence on God for salvation. And the promise of this first beatitude is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Being poor in spirit leads us toward salvation by grace through faith that God offers through Christ, and becomes the foundation of all the other beatitudes that lead to our spiritual maturity. You see, we cannot be filled until we are empty. God cannot fill what is already full. And we cannot be filled and helped by God until we humble ourselves and recognize our need for God's help. Amen.